So with that said, I'm now going to jump into our second product, which is Workbook Manager. And Workbook Manager, just to emphasize again, is very much this kind of concept of introducing software development lifecycle principles around your Excel real estate. So being able to provide that single source of truth, the capability of version audit history on those models as they kind of develop through their life cycle, and then also the capability to create the framework for these models to have API endpoints. And with those API endpoints, for those to also act as tests against the models. So as you check in new versions, you have the capability to run those tests to ensure that if you pass in a set of inputs, do you get the expected outputs? Is the model computing as expected? What you're seeing here on my screen is the Workbook Manager application. Here on the left-hand side where my cursor is, Ruben Test is a site that I have access to. In that site, I have access to a project and the Black-Scholes and example API for Excel. These are two Excel models that I've checked in. If I expand on any one of these, what I'll see is the API that's been created against this particular model. So let's import a new model. So the way how I'm going to do that is I'm going to come up to the menu and I'm going to focus on the management grouping first. If I click on import, Schematiq will allow me to navigate down to a particular location. I'm going to import our valuation model. And with that, the model is now imported. If I double click on that, in the middle, I'll get a visual representation. So let's start creating an API endpoint because that's going to be the base behind any kind of tests, any kind of, let's say, further interactions that we want to do with that model at a larger kind of IT strategic offering. To create the API endpoint, I just right click on the model name and we select the option New Function Definition. And I'm going to call my API test321. The reason why it's called new function definition versus API is in reality, a model could have multiple functions, multiple, let's say, uses, and all of those could contribute towards APIs around that model. So with that, I'm now going to double click on that new function, test321. What you'll see here is it's presenting me with an input and output section. So I need to define what are the inputs to this model and what are the computational cells that I want to be capturing from it. To do that, I scroll down and I'm just going to mimic what we did before when we were looking at Workbench. So I'm going to select these three cells as the inputs. As I right click and click on add input, you'll notice that it's capturing the named range that already exists in that cell. So I don't need to do anything special. I don't need to prep the model beforehand. Schematiq will leverage the content that's already in that model. And I'm going to do the same here with the outputs. So I'm just going to leverage these three named ranges to specify those cells. Now with that done, I'm pretty much done. I can click on compile, keep an eye down here in the output screen. I don't see any errors. Once it compiles, we present the user with this view, where here on the left-hand side, I see the three inputs that I had selected and let's say the default values which are there. And I now have the capability to run this model as code. When it runs, it will compute the three output cells. So this is where I can do my initial sanity check. Does this model compile with this? Does it produce the results I expect? So with this now done, what you may have noted if I go back up to Workbook Manager menu and look in the workspace, the save button has become illuminated because Workbook Manager is now prompting me to save the actions I have taken. So this adding the model, adding the API endpoint, etc. And if I click on the save button, it shows me the relevant assets against those actions. I click on add all and I click on save. And everything is being saved now to the end user's Git repo. With that, you'll now see this kind of, let's take the assumption that I've already deployed this as an API endpoint and that 2 weeks has passed and I get a requirement from my business users saying that we need to enhance this particular model. We need to change. How would that happen with Schematiq? Well, the way how that would happen is that the modeler who's going to be making the changes, he or she they would open up Workbook Manager, they would navigate to the relevant model, and they would check that model out in Excel. So if I right click, you'll see there's an option here, say open in Excel. So I'm going to open up this model, and what Schematiq will do is it will download the model from the Git repo into the user's or onto the user's C drive. Now, in reality, we know people aren't usually permitted to work on their C drive. So what we would expect is that someone's going to navigate away from that particular location and save the model elsewhere. So in this case, I'm just going to move to a different folder, and I'm going to call the model in a typical Excel naming convention, V2, and click on Save. Now, if that's saved, I'm going to make my edits. So I'm going to edit these formulas. So divided by 100 plus 100, and then the final edit divided by 100, and click on Save. I could make a load of structural changes. It doesn't really matter. To keep this kind of relatively simple for the interest of time, I'm just going to edit those three formulas. So now I've done my edits. I'm going to close the model. I'm going to go back into Workbook Manager. And I do have the capability, if you see where my mouse is, to sync that model to become the latest version. But ahead of doing that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a sanity check. I want to compare the latest version to what was originally checked out. And to do that, if I click on the compare button, we present this little kind of pop-up. The top location contains the original location of the model that was checked out. The second is just really prompting me in regards to navigating to the latest version. So I navigate to the latest version, I click on OK. Schematiq will ask me to save the results when it does this check somewhere. So I'm going to just save them down here in this location, and I'm going to call the model results, and I'm going to click on Save. Now, what Schematiq is doing is it's checking all of the values, all of the functions, cell protection, named ranges, formatting, and structure. The one thing we do not check is VBA code. We don't do any kind of diff comparison on VBA. And the rationale for that is if you cast your mind back to the workbench demo where we were forming actions on data and also on compute, we believe we have the capability to demand. We would rather end users leverage our proprietary functions to demise VBA. The comparison is now complete. But I'm going to navigate down to where the model is. Here it is, results. And when I open up this model, what you'll see is that we present just a very clean audit log of what has changed. I'm going to focus on column E first. And what this is saying is that there was 3 formulaic changes and 2 value changes. Column C shows me all of the content from the original checked out version. Column D shows me the content from the latest version. Now, what's interesting here is I've made 3 formulaics, but there's only 2 value changes. In theory, if I've made 3 formulaics, shouldn't there really be 3 value changes? Now, on closer inspection, I look at the cells that I've edited from a formulaic perspective, and I note the first formula and the third formula both have divided by 100. So maybe what this has caused on that third cell is that those changes have cancelled. Now, this may be right or wrong, but the reason why we're kind of displaying this is not only do we provide that kind of audit log, but we allow individuals to have the conversation. Are these changes expected, yes or no? In this case, let's say and with that, go back into Workbook Manager, and I'm going to perform the sync. So I click on sync. Here I have details of the original checked out version. Here I have details of the owner. Now I'm going to navigate to the new version. So there's the new version. I'm being prompted to save the change log, i.e. that result file. So I check that in, and I click on validate change type. Now, the reason why we have this validate change type is twofold. One, we want to validate the change log, the result file that's been checked in, is actually valid to the models in question. Secondly, we want to scan that column E. And if we identify from what was captured in that model that there are formulaic changes, we define the change type as sensitive, which you can see here where my cursor is. Now, this sensitive flag can act as a flag for any kind of peer-to-peer reviews or approval processes. Again, this is not something that we mandate, but we make it available, where if individuals require, let's say, extra approval steps because of a sensitive change, they have that capability. And then finally here, we ask for a comment to be added into why the change was done. Obviously, if folk integrate with Jira, they have the capability to put in Jira tickets, etc. And with that, we click on OK. Again, with all of that, the workplace grouping now becomes illuminated and we're prompted to save all of those changes into Git. So this is all now saved accordingly. And that's great. If in a year's time, 2 years' time, we get asked by someone, okay, please can you show us evidence? I'm now going to, let's say, upload all of these changes and we're going to create the API endpoint. So what Schematiq will do is it will take all of this, it will upload it into our repository, and with that, it will generate the API and it will deploy that accordingly. So it now becomes available. So Schematiq is just kind of running through all of the relevant tests for each one of these assets, making sure that everything builds correctly. And as it's doing that, it will compile and deploy those changes onto the Schematiq servers. So I get the message that this is all deployed successfully. If I now come into the portal grouping,